Ellarigu namaskara. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to poets all over the world. And I'm very honored to be here in the august company of such brilliant poets in the 15th World Poetry Festival of Venezuela. Thank you very much, Freddie Nenes, poet and director of the festival, Fernando Rendon, John Burnett, and the programming team. Thank you, Luz Maria Lopez and Uriel Antonio Molina for the translations. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. My first poem is called The Mountains Have a Memory. This poem is written for the beautiful Himalayas, the Kashmir, which is very famous. It's called The Mountains Have a Memory. The mountains have a memory of silence, slow rain, of a damp violet, unwritten poems, a shepherd's call, the laziness of the falling snow, and a wind taking birth among sleepy pines. The mountains seem to have swallowed the cry of every dawn, a soldier's bones, and the distance between a falling leaf and the ground. Yet they are calm, as if you're absent. Like nothing has walked past their burning valleys, and no one has wept, not even a blackbird, for her unborn child. Sometimes, suddenly, they come alive. The mountains breathe through wandering horse trails, wet honeybees, and the faint bleat of a lamb. No sooner they get quiet like a cemetery than they drown their solitude in my tiny palms. Perhaps someday they will wake up on my chest and remember that they too have a heart. My second poem is called Autumn. This autumn, we shed leaves one by one all evening. We are only branches by evening, roots by night. And when I stretch my nakedness towards your August, you shift your drizzling sonatas towards light, and we fall. Our bodies are now moving through the tenderness of the shadows of the deciduous trees, our feet sifting through gold and crimson sand, floating into each other's arms like the forgotten fragments of a distant fable. I now look up at the blue sky beyond the elm tree. The last leaf is now twirling down into your coppery hills. The oak and the beech listen to the soft treble of the dying wind and the cluster of the gathering swallows. It's time now to depart. Depart from the patter of the green moss, from the acorn's laughter, to leave the slopes of your shoulder, to walk away from the sweet kernel of your mist, with the sinking light and flaming leaves, and forever I will be left longing for the flutter of your autumn kiss. My next poem is called Silence. Silence is a slice of sea, a wall of soot, an intimate memory acquiring flesh. Silence is shallow water resting around your ankles. It is the evening light burying into a swallow's nest. Silence is a kiss that hovers over a pond, wet and unfinished. Silence is an empty wing that hands out hunger to the mountains. Silence is a door that opens like a book and closes like a poem. The next poem is called this poem. This poem is a house with closed doors where winter pauses to look into books for familiar earmarked pages or the absence of it. This poem is looking out of a window, swapping cities split, beginning to draw the sea into its lines, line by line. Like a soldier walking with heavy boots thinking of home. This poem is a paper boat sailing from you to me, black and white, wet, carrying children and islands who dream of waking up beside their mother. This poem is a street where somewhere, someday we would meet to find myself drawn to the absence with your hand in my chest. This poem is a poem that arrives for the second time. A boy covered in soot, sounds of his world reminding you that you never left where you started. The next poem is written for the people of Kashmir, and it's called This Is Not a Poem. This is not a poem. This is not a poem. It's a flesh filled words that walked out in the curfew. It's fish bones of a song, an envelope without words, tangled knot of burning chinars, surrender of a half cooked bread, empty blackboard in the schools. It is the silence of the snow in Gupkar, the fading light in your pupil. It's the testimony that a bullet found, a maternal uncle's madness, the sharp knell of forgiveness in a pellet-ridden eye or a tilted tongue, a periwinkle soaked in prayers. This is not a poem, because who has the time to write poem to a place that you will never visit? Who has the time to listen to the voices of an empty house? Who has the time to look into the eyes of people who may disappear tomorrow into graves? If by chance you have forgotten, like you normally do, this is not a poem. The next poem is called Mace. I unbutton your poems word by word, not as a tourist, but as a traveler, the one who sits on rooftops of buses, the one who does not take pictures, the one who likes to cycle through stanzas, stopping at bus stops, not to ask directions from strangers, but to find out their names and where they came from. I draw them out of camel tracks, Havelis, a bangle maker's hands, wrinkled like a used, unstarched cotton dhoti. Your poems are like drum beaters, chest thumpers, fire handlers, and acrobats, loud and obnoxious, the kind I do not want to read. I like stories that have thick walls, courtyard, priest, potholes, a Mangayanar singing while his tired wife looks on. Eagles flying over forts, opium clad deserts, stranded couple, a bird on the roof, and some warm milk. Stories where you meet your father's teacher, where windmills have lost their way, and blue painted houses that do not look spectacular, but just ordinary. Stories that have pitch darkness. I slip my hands between your words to caress the golden sand dunes, temple bells, like one would worship a family deity. I want to have arguments with your verbs, their carved windows, their narrow lanes. I want to meet them midway, being written and being heard. The next poem is called The Small Hands of Sivakasi. So, in the coming week, in the next 5 days, we have the grand festival of lights here in India. It's called the Diwali or Deepavali, as we call it here in South India. Some of the fireworks that comes to India, all over India, comes from a small place called Sivakasi, where children are made to do labor and create the firecrackers. So this is for them. Small hands of Sivakasi. They say that even birds that do not fly have wings, and jasmine open like umbrellas in the rain. In such a world, in all its fairness, tiny hands of Sivakasi, shining in silver like jari on Amma's pattu sari, rolling, rubbing, dipping aluminium onto paper, sulfur filled nostrils, mercury packed scalp, are building a legacy of blushing cheeks and gunpowder. Rotting like a bad fruit in dark windowless factories, the small hands of Sivakasi are busy at work, tying and untying bijlis of hope. But these things, they happen every other day. Somewhere in the corner, we know that they exist. And there are people who, for money, scar children with all their consciousness. And yet, we arrive to an open ground on Diwali to buy boxes of firecrackers, especially for our children, so that back home, together, all of us can burn the small hands of Sivakasi until the sky lights up and the earth below is filled with ashes. And they, the small hands of Sivakasi, are buried with their mouth open. The last poem is written for my grandfather, who left us a couple of years back. It's called Things That He Left Behind. My grandfather has left behind falling parijatas with orange stem, a courtyard that opens like the world with things to be discovered, yet familiar like a lover's skin. A living room where light flows like a river every morning, touching the banks of my grandmother's aching feet. He has left behind more grass that lean towards the sun and speak a language of togetherness. Mango trees that drop fruits into anyone's hands, he opened their palms into prayers. Broken tiles where a feeble bird in the roof will build her home. Slithering bookworms dwelling in musty pages with stories that long for closure. He has left behind my grandmother in a sulking room with open windows that draws broken things from the sea